Hello everybody and welcome to another Twilight Zone review. Today it is Season 4, Episode 9, Printer's Devil, written by Charles Beaumont and starring Burgess Meredith as Mr. Smith, Robert Sterling as Douglas Winter, and Patricia Crowley as Jackie Benson. And this episode, Printer's Devil, I enjoyed it overall. It's got some outdated elements to it and it's a little over the top in places. And actually, the ending is kind of hard to swallow too, but I enjoyed this as just kind of an entertaining episode. And Burgess Meredith, who makes his fourth and final Twilight Zone performance, does another great job here, as he always does. So I'll get started. We start in a newspaper office. The newspaper is called The Courier, I believe. And we're introduced to Douglas, our main character, and he's not happy, and we'll find out why in a minute. We're also introduced to Jackie, and we can tell that they have a thing going, and she's trying to make him feel better, but it's not really working. And we learn that the reason for this is because the paper is in a very bad situation. There's been a new paper in town called the Gazette, and they've been struggling ever since. And they owe a lot of money, and they're just not doing well. And at this point, Doug says he would do anything to make the paper do better, and you should always be careful what you ask for, because as we know, you just might get it. So Doug is in maybe even a worse way than we thought, and he's having some drinks. And it looks like he might even do himself in. They don't say it for sure, but it's kind of hinted at. And he runs into this Mr. Smith. And Mr. Smith talks him out of this and asks for a ride. So they go to a place to have some drinks. And Mr. Smith picks up the tab, so he's really getting in Doug's good graces here. And they talk about the paper, and Mr. Smith says, I'm a newspaper man, and I've been looking for a job. And I can report, I can operate the press machine, all these things. So Doug's thinking, yeah, right, can this guy really do all this? So Mr. Smith gives a demonstration back at the paper, and Jackie's there as well. And he's really quick on the printing machine. And he says, I can do this all the time for you. And Doug says, well, I would hire you, but we're out of business, basically. And Mr. Smith says he can pay the debts. So Doug is excited, if a little leery about this, and he agrees to the situation. So we go to the next day, and Mr. Smith comes in, and he shows Doug a scoop that he got. They check it out, and it turns out to be true, so they print an extra edition, and they do really well. So Mr. Smith continues this. He gets another scoop, and all of a sudden, they're getting all these new subscribers, and they're just doing really well. So a man from the rival paper, the Gazette, comes. He says, I could probably take you on, but you're hurting me some, so I'll buy you out. Doug gets a little bit cocky here, honestly, and he says, nah, I'm not selling. So what happens after that? The Gazette man leaves, not that happy, and a fire starts at the Gazette. Of course, we know by now that Mr. Smith has caused this, but Doug gets accused of it. Doug says, I have witnesses, leave me alone. And it's noteworthy that at this point, Jackie is also starting to question Mr. Smith. So Doug does question the man, and Smith says, I didn't have anything to do with it. It had something to do with the electricity or something. And Mr. Smith also says he doesn't want anyone messing with the machine. I wonder why that could be. So after a Doug and Jackie argument, Mr. Smith gets a new scoop. And he also tells Doug, if you like what's going on, we can make it permanent. Basically, you'll be the most successful newspaper man there is, but you'll have to sell me your soul. So then they have a pretty interesting conversation about whether Smith is the devil or some form of the devil or something like that. It's pretty interesting, if a little over the top, and some of the humor is a little strange, but it's okay. Ultimately, Doug is talked into signing this contract by Mr. Smith, which probably wasn't a good idea, but it will come into play very soon in the episode. So then we go to yet another scoop. At this point, I think we get the point with the scoops, but they have to fit in our format, so you know. So it turns out a building collapsed, and at this point, also, Mr. Smith kind of hints that he's interested in Jackie, and Burgess Meredith is really good in this scene. He's pretty creepy. So we get more scoops, and this just keeps going on, and Jackie and Doug continue to argue because she wants Mr. Smith gone. Doug says there's nothing he can do about it, so Jackie basically says she's going to leave the paper, but Mr. Smith tries to convince her to stay because he says he's taken a liking to her, which we already knew, and Jackie slaps Mr. Smith. This probably wasn't the best idea in the world, as we'll see very soon. So Doug basically calls out Smith. He says he's had enough. After Jackie leaves, he wants him gone. And Smith says there is no way out. He says, actually, there might be one way out. If you're done in or do away with yourself, the contract will be null and void. It will be over. So they argue some more, and Smith basically puts Doug in a bad spot where he says he prints out a story and it says Jackie's going to have a car crash. And Doug gets mad about this, and Smith says, well, you have two options. You can either do what I say, or I can finish off the story, and she won't survive. So this is a bad dilemma. So then Jackie, in a scene where she's not too smart, gets tricked into driving Smith to the airport because he says he will leave on his own. Why he would just suddenly do this. She should have been a little more suspicious, in my opinion. And then she lets Smith drive on top of it. Probably not a good idea. So Smith's driving in an admittedly well done and pretty tense scene where they go back and forth between him and Doug writing a story, which I'll get into in a minute. And the scene has a lot of tension building up as Smith goes faster and faster, and it looks like the accident might happen. And then the accident really actually does happen. But it turns out that Jackie's okay. She was just dazed a little bit, and Mr. Smith is gone. He's disappeared, and we never do find out what happens to him, which is kind of unfortunate. And we also find out that Doug wrote a story that somehow voided the contract, which feels like a really, really cheap cop-out ending. But I guess it's okay. It wasn't that bad. It just bothered me a little bit. That was the best thing you could have come up with after all this story. But things turn out good for Doug and Jackie. I guess Doug's learned his lesson, although he says he's going to take on the Gazette on his own. How is he going to do this without some help? It didn't work before. But anyway, I won't think too hard about it. It's just an entertaining episode, and Burgess Meredith always gives it his all every time, and Patricia Crowley's pretty good in supporting work too. Robert Sterling's okay. He's just kind of there. It's an okay episode to watch. It's very dated. Obviously, we get our news in many different ways now. Even though newspapers are still around, obviously we have more than just newspapers. But if you just go with the episode, it's fine. So I'm going to give Printer's Devil a 3 out of 5. Certainly worth a one-time watch, especially if you're a fan of Burgess Meredith Twilight Zone episodes. So a 3 out of 5 for Printer's Devil. And as always, thanks for watching.